Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to create some Paper Roses Inky color cards. Spellbinders recently got a bunch of Paper Roses products to put on their website and sent over a couple of things to create with and share with you. So the things that I'm sharing is the Wedding Blooms die set as well as the Inky color pad. Now this is a 6x6 pad, but look at how gorgeous and vibrant those colors are. They're double-sided cardstocks and they have a slight gloss to them. They're definitely not totally shiny, but they have a slight gloss to them, and the paper is really nice and sturdy for a printed paper. I've never worked with Paper Roses papers before. I've used a few of their dies in the past, but I absolutely love these papers. Now, I was going to create only A2 cards for this, but I paused here when I was going to cut this piece of paper here and decided to make a 5x7 card. So I cut this down to 4x6, but these papers are absolutely stunning. I couldn't get over the vibrancy of them. I took some lunar gray cardstock. Because the lines in the printed paper had more of a gray tone to them, I thought it would be a good cardstock to use as a mat behind it. I cut that to 4 1/4 by 6 1/4, pausing there on my measurements, and then I glued it to a 5x7 card base and then glued the printed paper over top of that. Now I thought that printed paper was gorgeous enough that it really didn't need much else, so all I did was add a sentiment. And for the sentiment, I used that scrap that I cut off of it, and I used that for the sentiment and then used some lunar gray cardstock for the shadow. So don't be afraid to use your printed papers to cut up to do your sentiments, and I do that a couple times in this video because I don't want to waste those papers, and they've got such beautiful colors and color variation. It was a great way to tie it in. It also saved from trying to find a solid cardstock that I liked for that piece, and this particular sentiment that I'm using is from the wonderful Script Sentiments die set. It's a really beautiful font. I love them. There's a few different die sets that have these scripty fonts from them, and I just went and put a very simple hello onto this card. So I glued that sentiment onto its shadow. I'm using Barely Art glue in a fine line bottle, which works really nicely for really fine sentiments like this. To add just a tiny little bit of extra texture, I do go over it with some glossy accents, and I have that in a fine tip bottle as well, but you certainly don't need to do that step. You can just leave it as is. I just wanted to step it up just a tiny little bit. So by adding that glossy accents, it just adds just a little bit more gloss to that sentiment. Now, because this sentiment is very fine and very scripty, some of that glossy accents wants to flow over onto my shadow. And what I do when I'm done putting the glossy accents on there, I take a die pick and I use that to remove any of the excess glossy accents that's gone where I haven't wanted it to go. And that works really well. It's got a nice pointed tip to it, so it's a great tool for cleaning that up and making it look nice. If you happen to have a little bit of bubbles in your glossy accents, use a pin to pop them, and you definitely want to pop that before you let that dry. Once I had let that dry, I just set it aside and started working on my next one. For my next one, I decided to stamp and emboss this Agapanthus stamp set. This is a Stampendous stamp set. I've done a video with these Stampendous backgrounds and used a few different techniques with them, so you'll find those a few videos back, or more than a few videos back. I don't know how long ago it was. I have no concept of time right now. So all I'm doing is using that stamp in my Misty stamping tool, and I'm stamping it with Versamark ink. And then I'm going to emboss it with Hickory Smoke embossing glaze. Now, embossing glaze is a transparent embossing powder, so you're going to see some of that pattern behind it. It's dark. It's kind of like a dark gray. So it's not going to be you're not going to be able to see a lot of the detail behind there, but I didn't want something as stark as black. I wanted something a little bit more subtle, so I chose the Hickory Smoke for that. I think this would also be absolutely gorgeous embossed with metallic embossing paper or embossing powder as well. This is what I chose for this particular project. I wanted those papers to really shine through because I just couldn't get over how beautiful and how vibrant it was. And to be honest, the hardest part of this whole project was deciding which side of the printed papers I wanted to use. They are absolutely gorgeous, and I did save a few of the pieces to do for future videos because I had other ideas with future collections for them. So you'll see some coming up in other videos. So once I have this embossed, this one I am going to turn into an A2 card. So I'm going to cut this down to 4 inches by 5¼ inches, and then I'm going to cut a mat with that same lunar gray cardstock because it works beautifully with this background or with this embossing powder. I'm going to cut that to 5 3/8 by 4 1/8. And then that piece that I cut off there, I'm going to use that to die cut my sentiment for this card as well. But I'm going to use the opposite side because the opposite side didn't have quite as many colors as that front there. So I used the thank you sentiment die set. Very simple thank you. I really like the font in this one, and I again love the fact that it has a shadow. It makes it so easy to put these sentiments onto cards because you can glue those letters onto that shadow and then glue the entire piece onto your cards. Just makes it a lot easier, and I think they stand out so much better when they have a shadow behind them. I am using some reverse tweezers to help me hold those die cuts while I'm putting the glue on them. Takes up less space. My fingers don't get in the way. I don't get as much glue onto my fingers when I do it that way as well. And the nice thing about reverse tweezers is you can hold your piece and transfer it from hand to hand without having to worry about squeezing those tweezers to get a hold of your, or to keep holding onto your die cut. So they come in really handy. I use them so often because they're an invaluable tool in my craft room. So once I have that background put onto my card base, I can glue on my sentiment. For this card base, I chose a nice beautiful blue because it tied in with that background. You can use whichever color you like to go with your printed papers, but I absolutely love the subtle flower background here with that thank you sentiment. Again, if you wanted it more prominent, you could absolutely do a darker embossing powder or a metallic embossing powder. I didn't want to hide too much of that printed paper. For my third card, I'm bringing out that Wedding Blooms die. Now this is a unique die. It cuts a strip with a pattern in between it. So I wanted to do this on my card base. Now, when I'm putting it through my Spellbinders Platinum 6 machine, there is a very long, rigid edge to this die that makes it hard for it to go through the machine. Most of the time, if you have dies like this, if you put them on an angle, it makes it much easier for your machine. But because I'm doing this on the card base, I'm very limited as to how I can put this on the machine. And you can see that the machine has a little bit of trouble going through all of that pattern, especially at this angle. So I turned my die so the die was blade up and then tried to put it through, and it went better, but there's still an area that it was not cutting properly. So then I added just a cardstock shim underneath my bottom cutting plate, and that helped as well. That gave it a little bit of extra pressure and made it so that I could get through that die cut background. I taped this die cut in place just to make sure that I could move it around and didn't have to worry about that die shifting on me. And by taping it with that Best Ever Craft tape, it worked absolutely perfectly. You can see a tiny little bit of an indent from where that tape was, but it's not very noticeable once that card is completely done. So this is a brand new die, so it really wanted to stay into that paper there. So you do need to be careful taking it off. And what I find is the best tool to take a lot of those little pieces out, as well as taking it off of my card, is using the Spellbinders Tool-in-One. I've had this tool for ages, and when you have a die cut that has so many little tiny pieces in it, you can see how many of those little pieces that tool just easily pulls out. I'm still being careful taking that die out, doing it just a little bit at a time, mainly because there's areas that are kind of going all different ways, so there's not just one perfect way to get this off. Once I have that die out of there, I can take a die pick and remove any of those excess little bits that are still in there. And there's really very few compared to how many there were in total. So that tool-in-one really makes that job a lot easier. Once I have all of that taken out, I can choose my printed paper to go behind it. I thought the printed papers worked beautifully behind this die set just because of the colors. And I'm going to cut a piece of that printed paper that is that full A2 size. just slightly narrower to accommodate for the fold in the card. This way, when you open up the card, it's going to be printed paper in that right side. It's not going to be just a strip of it. You could always do a strip of printed paper if you wanted to make it go a little bit farther, and then do a white piece of cardstock behind it if you wanted to not see that in the front. That's another solution as well. I thought it would be beautiful to see that in the front just because I really love these papers and didn't want to hide them. I'm going to use that same Barely Art glue to glue this on, and I'm making sure with the die cut in the center or in the strip to put some glue on any of the pieces that are sticking out so that nothing can catch on the envelope or anything. I don't need to put glue on absolutely every surface of this die cut, but just the pieces that are sticking out is good. Once those are glued down, then you are good to go. Once I have enough glue there, I'm going to line up my outer edge of my card as well as the top edge of my card, and then put an acrylic block on there to let that completely dry. Once that's dry, I did cut this just a hair too long. So once that's completely dry, I'll take my trimmer and just trim that little strip off to make it perfectly flush with the bottom of the card. And you can see how easy it is to put a card together like this. I'm adding a sentiment. This one is from the Typewriter Adventure stamp set, and it has a ton of little tiny sentiments on there. I didn't want to have anything that was too large or could cover the floral die cut, so I just wanted a very tiny sentiment. And this one is Happiness Blooms, so it works absolutely perfect for the floral die cut. Chose the Picked Raspberry Distress Pad. It worked perfectly with those ink colors, but really because there are so many different colors in there, you can choose whichever color you wanted. Now I chose to put my sentiment horizontal with the bottom of the card. I think it would also be beautiful if you did it going just up the side of the strip as well. And by using my Misty stamping tool to stamp it, I could make sure to stamp it a couple times to make sure that I had a perfectly clear sentiment for the whole thing. For finishing off this die cut, I chose to use the Crystal Mix Adhesive Gems. This particular package comes with two different finishes. I'm using the one that has the iridescent finish to it. I thought it was beautiful with the different colors in the printed papers, and I'm using a die pick to just kind of pierce into the adhesive behind them and helping to pick it up, then laying it where I want it in the die cut. And I'm just putting these in the centers of the flowers, and then using my left hand or a finger from my left hand to press that down to make sure that adhesive has some good contact. And it just adds the perfect amount of sparkle. If you didn't have any adhesive gems, you could also use some stickles or something like that just to add that little bit of sparkle in the center of the flowers. I think it just finishes it off beautifully. For my fourth and final card, I wanted to do that same Wedding Blooms die set again, but I wanted to show you that you don't have to do it within the card base. You can easily do it as a separate piece and then glue it onto the base of the card. So I'm using a matte finish cardstock from the Gold Treasured Cardstock Pack. This is a cardstock pack that has 15 sheets of specialty gold papers in there, and there's 5 different finishes. So I love the fact that they all come in the same package. You can use them with each other or separate, but it makes it really easy to pick and choose which finish is going to work best for the project that you're doing. I taped that die cut down again just to make sure it wasn't going to shift on me. And this time, because I could place this in different ways on my die cutting machine plate, you can see I die cut through it much easier. I didn't have to have that horizontal with the rolling mechanism in my die cutting machine. So it just gave it much better pressure, and I only had to put it through, well, what you saw there. I didn't have to put it through any more than that. I can use that same tool-in-one to remove as many of those little die cut bits as possible. And then I can take the rest of this die cut out. I cut most of that out because it's the same as the first time. And there's not much point in repetition. For my printed paper, I'm just going to use the strip that was cut off from the last card. Once again, might as well make good use of it. It is the perfect width. It's not too wide for the gold piece, and it's not too narrow for the center of this strip. So it was like it was meant to be. Now, my gold strip here, I cut it to 2 inches. So this strip or the die cuts just a little bit narrower than that. And I really like the look of the 2 lines of gold on either side of it. I think it finishes it off beautifully. Because I'm creating this on a different card, I figured I would do a different orientation. So the last card I did vertical. This one I'm going to do horizontal. And for this one, I am going to do the sentiment going up one side of the die cut. But I don't want to glue that on and then do my sentiment, because I am going to emboss it with gold to match the gold finish of the specialty paper there. So I just laid the piece down where I wanted it to go, put my stamp there, and then stamped and embossed it. So I'm using Versamark ink to stamp it. I am stamping it 2 times just to make sure that I have a nice clear sentiment here. I did use an embossing powder tool. I want to make sure that that embossing powder only sticks to the ink and isn't sticking to the rest of my card. Because the sentiment that I'm using is so tiny, it's really, really difficult for a tiny brush to clean it up and fix it up. So by using that embossing powder tool to make it as crisp and clean as possible is really helpful. Once that's done, I can use my heat tool to melt that embossed image. And then I can add my die cut piece to that. So I do have when I first put it down, it was a little bit crooked, so I will lift it up and straighten it up just a little bit because it is somewhat visible here. You can see that my glue has already started setting here, but that's okay. It wasn't set enough that I couldn't just pick it up and then let that completely dry. I wanted to add gems in the center of this one as well, just because I really liked it for the last one, but I chose different ones. So I'm using berry colored gems here. It's a nice, beautiful pink color. It works well with the cardstock colors underneath, and it works well for the centers of flowers. And for both of these ones where I'm using gems, I'm using 2 different sizes. I'm using the larger ones for the larger flowers and the smaller ones for the smaller flowers. I just love the look of the different sizes, and it gives it a little bit of variation. So here are 4 different cards using that Inky color pad. I absolutely love it. I just can't, this first one here, I just can't get over that image. I think it's absolutely gorgeous. Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate you spending your time with me, and I hope you have a fantastic day.